Hi all! I guess it's going to be another very warm day. I'm going to see if I can escape my craft room for a bit. We're going to do that by starting on the chemise for my regency costume. I'm going to make that with the Laughing Moon pattern number 115. It's the same pattern as that I'm going to be using for my short stays. So for today I will be pattern tracing the chemise patterns, and I'll be cutting them out of fabric, the actual fabric. I'm not going to make a mock-up for the chemise. So, yeah, let's get started. So, a little extra explanation might be in order here. Usually, the fabric is folded in half, where the standard folded edge and the non-folded edge is then called a selvage. The pattern layout told me to fold the selvages to the middle so that we have two fabric folds. So in this case we could place the front and the back pattern pieces to a fold. However, even though I had the correct fabric width, this did not fit. After much thinking, I realized they used the terminology differently. They folded the fabric lengthwise. This way, the pattern pieces did fit. It might look a bit weird when I do it, because I had bought extra length, as I also want to make the stays out of this fabric, so I have leftover fabric. In the end, the way it was described, it caused a lot of confusion, but eventually I managed to cut everything out correctly. Never before have I had pieces on my table that were this big. Then again, I guess that's what comes with never having sewn any dresses or something like that before. Let me see, we have the front, then we need the strap. Looking at the picture, it's the white side that has to go down, and this is the right side. This is the right side of the fabric, this is the right side of the fabric, so then it should go on like that. Notch matches to the notch. And then we have a seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch. Yeah. Which means that translates to approximately 1.5 centimeter. I still don't like working with inches, so I usually round off to something nearest in the metric scales. Because on my inches ruler, well, I can see the inches, but I can't see the fractions, so I have no idea how you guys usually work with all the fractions. There we go. And now we can sew these. The straps have been sewn on, and I double checked. 5/8 of an inch is 1.688 centimeters, so I'm rounding down to 1.5 centimeters, which would mean that the entire thing gets 1 millimeter wider, which is not that much, so that's a rounding down error we can make. Rounding up error in this case. But now we have to cut this seam allowance down to 1/4 inch, which is 1.6 millimeters, so I rounded down to 0.5 millimeter. which means that we'll get slightly less seam allowance, but half a centimeter is still more than enough. And it was just for the strap. Wait a second, just the strap seam allowance. Maybe I should not have cut that. Yeah, I should not have cut this part. Oh well. Because now we have to make a felt seam. Which is not going to work that great with the very short seam allowance. I thought I just had to cut this entire part, but it's just this part. Oops. Let's see how to fix that. Stupid of me. Let me think about this for a bit. I'll come back to you when I got the solution. I think I got it. I think they only want me to make the seam for this part, not that part. So I have to cut it there anyway. Because they want me to make a flat felt seam, aka fold this over, flip this up, and then stitch through it. But then you get this weird part here. And the entire neckline is going to be bound anyway. So I'm going to make a cut here. There. Which means that for this side, I guess I'll just flip it up and stitch it through. That way it's not properly bound, as in the seam allowance is not flipped over it. And we do have a raw edge, but for now I think that's the best we can do. Or I'll zigzag stitch it. Could do that as well. But anyway, this one has to be flipped over. And then we can just stitch this. And then we have a pretty seam. Zigzag stitching will make this seam a bit harder, as in a bit more rough to the touch. And that's something that you don't really want with a chemise that is going to lay flat against the skin. On the other hand, this is a garment that needs to be able to withstand washing and everything, so I think I will zigzag stitch it. Yes, I'm going to zigzag stitch it and regularly stitch that one. The straps are sewn on and finished, and none the wiser that the finishes on the back are different. This is the one where I accidentally cut off all the seam allowance, and on the back I used a relatively wide zigzag stitch so it's not as coarse, and this is still okay to put straight against the body. On the other side we have the proper felt seam, and it's also nicely finished on the back. Maybe I should have ironed them before turning them over, but currently it's slightly too warm to use an iron all the time. So unless it's 100% necessary, I'm trying to avoid using an iron. So next up, we're going to attach the straps to the back piece as well. We can now start by adding the sleeves. This is the front of the chemise, this is the back of the chemise. And again, we have to match some notches. So we've got the 3 notches here, and the shoulder seam, and another notch here, which is 3 notches here, the shoulder seam, and another notch there. So we can flip this over. Right sides together, and then we can pin it all the way from here to there, again with the seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters. and stitch it all together. Yesterday, before it got too warm to sew on, we ended up with attaching the sleeves. If we now flip the front over the back, we can actually see it taking the shape of the chemise. Today we're going to put in the gusset under the sleeve. I already did that for this sleeve. Usually I show you my very first attempt at doing something and I'll just record the first one. The gusset was a bit finicky to get in. So in this case I will show you the second gusset. It's a bit weird because simultaneously it was easier to put in than I thought, and on the other hand I threw most of the instructions out of the window. So I'm not sure if I actually put it in properly or if I did something really weird, but I will show you the way that I put the gusset in and I think it looks okay, so let's just do it that way. I flipped the chemise over, so currently we're looking at the back panel, and I'm going to attach the gusset like, see what's the right side of the fabric. This is right side of the fabric. We are going to attach it like so. Inserting the gusset is always a bit finicky with all the seam allowances because all that I have to sew right now is everything up until the seam allowance. I'm not stitching all the way through the fabric, I'm just stitching up until the seam. Again, this has 1.5 centimeters of seam allowance. So I'm attaching the gusset only to the one side of the sleeve, I'm not pinning all the way through. Furthermore, I did line up these notches, but I'm going to ignore this notch because there is no notch here and this will not go on the notch on this side. So I'm not sure what's going on there and what that's supposed to be, but yeah, this can be stitched. The gusset has been stitched on 1.5 centimeters, so basically the seam allowance has been left unstitched on this side and has not been stitched on this side. And now we can flip this over. We can flip the entire chemise over so that it is inside out again. As you can see, here we have the sleeve with the attached gusset flap. So the gusset has been flipped out and the instructions now say pivot the gusset around the pivot point, but I wouldn't call folding it backwards pivoting. Yet all we have to do now is attach this side to the body of the chemise. So the terminology that they use in this pattern is again a bit weird, but I guess we can live with that. Except that before, in earlier instructions, they told me to stitch the sleeve on in its entirety. Yet I'm not sure if you can see that because it's a bit finicky again. If I want to attach this to the body, I'm having a bit extra because the entire seam allowance is attached here. So I'm going to unpick the seam allowance part. So I'm going to unpick the last 1.5 centimeters so that we can attach the gusset in an actual straight line. So this has been reattached, this has been unpicked, which means that right now we can actually continue this stitch line with the gusset. The gusset has now been stitched on two sides of the gusset. The chemise is folded over at the shoulder seam. I made a notch here and there are some notches here. So I can see that this is the shoulder seam, which means that the sleeves are lining up where they will eventually be attached. Right now we're going to flip over the entire chemise, so that we're now looking at the front panel. again making sure that the chemise is folded at the shoulder seam. There we go. Now we have this awkward triangle sticking out here, which will be folded over like so, in a triangle. And now we're basically going to do the same thing on this side as on the other side, which is attaching the gusset to this seam and to that seam. But before we do that, again we have to unpick some of this seam allowance, just because otherwise we can't attach this properly. The seam allowance gets in the way. So let's unpick that and re-strengthen it. Okay, now this will look chaotic. But we've lined up the gusset edge with the sleeve edge, not caring about shoulder seam or anything, just making sure that these two seams are flat on top of each other on the table so I can pin them easily. This here is the seam between the sleeve and the gusset, so you can see the triangle shape. Well, it's sort of there. Again, making sure that the seam allowance sticks out 1.5 centimeters over the edge of the sleeve. Now we have a gusset with 3 sewn edges. And you can already see a sleeve starting to happen here. And oh, this is again the back of the chemise. So now all we have to do is attach the last side of the gusset to the front of the chemise. Just put them together. Again, fold the chemise in such a way that these two seams can lay flat on top of each other on the table. That makes stitching, or at least pinning, a lot easier. And all we have to do for this one is play connect the dots, because we have a corner here and we have the corner on this side, which means that we don't have to measure out 1.5 centimeter, we just have to connect the corner to the corner, which, if we sewed it neatly, should be 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, but we'll see about that. That is exactly 1.5 centimeters. Isn't that fancy? And now that this one is pinned, let's stitch the last gusset seam. The seam we just stitched was this one, and now you can see that when you put the chemise back in the shape that it's supposed to be, you see a nice triangle of the square gusset that we just inserted. Because the way that the gusset folds, the seam allowance might get in the way. So we're going to cut bits of it off. And that doesn't have to be much, it's just mainly the corners, because the gusset will want to bend around those corners. So all I'm doing is just cutting notches in the seam allowance of the gusset only. I'm not cutting into the seam allowance of the rest of the chemise. There we go. And that means that we can unfold the chemise, or at least put the right side out again, which results in a sleeve with a gusset sewn in. So I'm did this entirely different than what the instructions told me, but I think in the end I ended up with the same thing, so that's good. It is time to stitch the last few seams, starting with the sleeves. And right now I only need to stitch this tiny bit that we didn't stitch yet when we did the gusset. And then after the sleeves have been stitched, last but not least, we can do the entire side seam of the chemise. With the side seams and the sleeve seams finished, all of the seams on the chemise have been finished and it looks like an actual chemise. What remains now is to finish all of the seams with flat felt seams, so that will take me a while, but that we're almost done. Over the past few days I mostly finished the seams on the chemise. I did the long side seams by machine, and the shorter seams around the sleeves I did by hand. Reason for that being that this wasn't easy to maneuver under the machine. So this is what it looks like on the inside of the garment. And this is what it looks like on the outside of the garment. You can quite clearly see the difference between where it is machine stitched and where I stitched it by hand. But I don't mind that. I think it looks okay like this. Which means that next up it is time to finish the ends of the sleeves and the bottom of the chemise. I'm going to do this by making a rolled over hem, so that's flip it once and then flip it again and then just stitch through it. The seams at the bottom of the chemise and on both sleeves have been finished nicely by rolling them over twice. These have again been stitched by machine. It's now time for the very last step of the chemise, which is to add the neckline binding. We are going to attach this by putting this on the right side of the chemise, stitching it, then flipping it over and attaching it to the wrong side of the chemise. I'm going to thread a ribbon through this so we can pull and adjust the size of the neckline. But for now that means that we have to start to pin this. And in this way we're going to pin the binding all around the neckline. The binding has been pinned to the neckline. I did realize I made some sort of mistake. I wanted to have the seam end up at the center back. But I started pinning with the edge of the binding, which means that I did not have any seam allowance here. So what I did is I unpinned some of it and I'm making the seam here. This saves me having to unpin and repin everything. And that means that the seam will be, not center back, but so obviously to the right that it doesn't look as if it was supposed to be center back anyway. Also, these corners are quite difficult to pin because we have a straight edge fabric that has to go around the 90-degree angle corner. So this is going to be fun to stitch. But with everything pinned, it's time to stitch this, and then after that stitch the entire neckline. Before I'm going to flip over the basting, I'm going to insert 2 eyelets at the center front. They are 2 centimeters apart. So first of all, I'm making the holes with an awl. That's one. And that's 2. And to actually hammer the eyelets in, taking the eyelets. And both eyelets are in. I have made prettier eyelets on the back side, but at least they're in quite secure. I won't be able to take these off, and we'll cover the backs anyway. It's just the front that gets seen. So next up is to flip over all of the binding and attach it on the back. I'm going to make it a tiny seam, so fold it over and then fold that over again. And I'm probably going to hand stitch all of this all around. We're also done with sewing on the binding. The binding has been sewn on by hand on the inside, where I only picked up the seam allowance, so this way you don't see the stitches on the outside of the binding. Now, the only thing that remains is to pull this cord through the eyelets. Just pulling the cord through the eyelets is not going to work. So for that, I take a safety pin. And thread it through this way. There we go. And now, because the safety pin is a hard surface, we can easily pull all of this. Just thread the cord all the way through. And with the cord finished and tied in a bow, the chemise is done. I think it looks quite nice and like a proper chemise. However, when putting in the cord, I did realize that the cord looked a bit modern, so I might eventually switch that one up later. But overall, I'm quite happy with it, and let's see how it fits.